Rhino 8 has brought the content cache to Grasshopper. We used to have a component called geometry cache. The geometry cache looks very similar to the content cache. The component is used to hold geometry in a cache. This means that instead of baking and creating new geometry every time, we can bake new geometry and delete the existing contents of the cache at the same time. It is like a version control with extra steps. In this video, we'll be comparing the two. Similar to the content cache, your geometry cache component will change to push or pull, but this does not have a selection, but instead it will depend on the connection. Here we have selected two caches. The first cache is connected to the geometry and it will act as a push button. And the second cache is connected to an output geometry, so it will act as a pull button. So we can push and then pull geometry into the container. Now how this works is that when you are pushing geometry, it will add a user text that contains the object's cache and its place in the cache array. When objects are baked with content cache, this no longer happens. You can see that the user text field is empty. Now because the cache data is stored in the user text, this meant that you could edit this manually. So I can add a Rhino geometry to cache 1. Now if I pull the geometry, it's going to contain the geometry that I added. Now notice, if I would push here, this would delete the component because it replaces the cache contents with the geometry container's contents. Now when I pull, it disappears completely. Here I have some caches with moved geometries connected to them. If I were to push content into these caches that have similar names to others that already have data in them, this will override the data that is in the cache. This works just the same with the old and the new component. If I have cache 2 and I push content into it and push other content into cache 2, it's going to remove the previous content. Now if I pull, both of these should yield the same results, which they do. If you try to connect other data than geometry, it is going to give you an error. Also, if you connect it from the both ends, it's going to say that it's acting as a geometry container. So basically it means that it does nothing. The new component has cache names as a parameter. So this means that you can use the data tree structure and push into multiple caches with the same component. Here is an example with two caches. So we baked the same geometry into two caches and we pulled only from cache 3 and moved that geometry by 1000 millimeters. A new cache can be connected with an action, so it will act continuously. So this data here is going to get rebaked even if I try to delete it, because this is set to a constant instead of a button. So the conclusion is that the new component content cache that replaces the old geometry cache is more versatile, can take other types of content than just geometry, for example layers, can be used with data tree structures, and possibly has some performance increases when the data is no longer stored in the user texts. Of course, this limits the user's possibilities to edit the caches manually through the Rhino UI. As an added bonus, the new component has the ability to hide and show inputs and outputs.